Hello and welcome to There's No Business Like, a podcast where friends and industry colleagues explore topics and interview leaders in our industry of professional theatrical touring.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to There's No Business Like. I'm your favorite host, Katie, here to introduce the conversation Josh had a few weeks ago with Angela Meleca of Meleca Creative Advisors. They have an in-depth conversation about the state of the field, fundraising, and the role that data does and could play in the future of our industry. Now, make sure you tune in next week for the Pod Squad's follow-up conversation to this interview. I promise you it will be a good one. While you're here, just want to remind you to follow us on social media. We would love for you to comment, share your thoughts with us on the episodes. We would really love to hear from you. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this week's conversation with Angela Meleca.
I am Angela Meleca, CEO of Meleca Creative Advisors.
Thanks for joining us, Angela. Can you start us off by kind of giving us a little bit of your background? You didn't get into the arts world until a little bit later in life after a long career in journalism that then led to a career in politics and government and then into the arts world. So can you kind of give us a little bit of that background and that arc and how that happened?
I have always been interested in government since high school and journalism reporting. And so always felt that that would be my life's work professionally. Personally, I don't come from an artistic family, but when I was 13, my oldest sister got married, and her father-in-law was a retired executive and painted in his retirement and gifted them an original painting for their wedding present. And I thought that that was the most fantastic gift or object I had seen, coming from a family youngest of 7, growing up with a bunch of family photos on the wall and posters and things like that. To see original artwork was just a really fascinating and cool thing for me. And so that impression stuck. And really in my 20s, when I was then out of college and starting my professional career in journalism, I wanted to collect original art. I was one of those that said, I don't want to have anything on my walls if it can't be original. And so that's really where this whole art passion started. And then later in life, as I kind of went through my course of really wanting to have a sense of contributing back to community. I love stories. I love learning about people. We can get into a little bit how opening a gallery came about, which was, not something at all that was planned. But that really then propelled me to where I am today, which I think is a perfect marriage of my professional academic training experience, taking that 20 years and now the last more than a decade honing it down into the arts, creatives, etc.
So how did opening a gallery come about? Because you were, at the time, just prior to opening your gallery, you were the full-time press secretary for the Ohio Senate.
Yeah, it was, covering politics for a long time and then leaving and getting back into it on the other side was great for me. Again, I've always been fascinated with government and with the political process and all of that. And so I was working really just thrilled to be the voice of the Senate president and helping lead communications for Ohio's Senate majority, all of the senators, and just that collaborative nature and being a good resource for them. The Senate president that I worked for was term limited. And so a little surprising because typically when you're working for the caucus, not necessarily for an individual, that caucus staff stays regardless who is the next president. But this was at a time where we started seeing a shift in party behavior, and the incoming president, I think, just wanted a new direction. And I had the sense that it was time to move on. Oddly, I really wanted to dig into my passion for the arts. I didn't have disposable income at the time to actually collect art. And so I approached some galleries in town and said, hey, can I help market you communicate, et cetera, to which one recommended, you should open your own gallery. We owned a building downtown. We had street front space in it. So I literally Googled how to run a commercial art gallery, took some books out of the library, and the consistent theme that I found were two things. If you can afford your overhead, which naively I thought, I don't need to pay myself, and we own the building, so I don't have to pay rent. Translation, can my husband absorb all of the costs and not rent that space out to somebody else? And then secondly, can you market yourself so people know you exist? And I just thought, well, that's my background, and so that's what I'm going to do. It was truly the most vulnerable thing I've ever done. I thank my husband for kind of pushing me out to do it. He owned his own architecture firm, so he knew how to own and run a small business and how to go out there on your own. It was the most rewarding in being able to give artists who didn't otherwise have a platform to show their work to do that. But then I really realized now, as I look back, I was treating that as a investigative process where I was really able to understand up close and personal, not only how to run a small arts business, but working with artists and working with other art institutions and collaborating with them.
In the art gallery space, did you have anyone that was helping to guide you in any way or mentoring you in any way or sharing knowledge in any way? That a lot of that is readily available through different programs within the performing arts touring world. Just from the way that you described it, it doesn't sound like that was present. So it was literally you doing the research, figuring out how to create that as a business, and then launching it yourself.
I want to say it was January of 2013. I told my husband, this is what I think I want to do. We identified that we would open in the fall. So I pretty much took that 9 months to try to figure out what the heck I was doing. I didn't know what hanging center on the wall meant. I didn't know what curating meant. We went to the Armory show in New York to look at art, and I was more drawn to work that I didn't understand than a landscape or something like that. I wanted to be challenged, and so I wanted to engage and understand, why is that art and what is that saying? So that was the first step. I would say that the most challenging for me was identifying artists that I wanted to work with, because my whole notion was, who am I to say that this work is not only worthy to come see, but to spend your money on? That was an awkward or difficult thing for me. So I had to be drawn to the work and then go into understanding, what am I drawn about? So that was happening. But then what I also did was I started going to the museum. We've got, 2 museums in town. We've got a fine arts school in town. So really starting to befriend curators and asking questions. So again, there was a lot of that natural curiosity, but I would ask, why am I drawn to that? Or what is it about this work that's speaking to me? That was the beginning of really a self-taught way of engaging with art. And then the deeper that I felt that I could understand why an artist was making work in a particular way or what they were saying. And I would say that most of the work that I was drawn to had some sort of political, social undertone to it. It wasn't the easiest sellable work. And that really wasn't what I was drawn to, although I did need to survive. I was drawn to something that would engage, something that was communicating, that was enlightening in some way.
That's what you were drawn to, but how do you, from scratch, start to build a network of artists that you can draw from to even begin to curate a gallery?
Oh, and it's interesting because I still do the same thing now. I'm waking up in the middle of the night and just looking a lot. I would say it was constant learning and tweaking. So the first year, it was a certain way of networking or finding artists. A lot of it was word of mouth, but then it was just learning how to look. It was just a lot of attending events at the museum where there was contemporaries talking. It was just, again, asking questions, surrounding myself with whom I thought were the smartest art minds. Again, a lot of that translated more academic heavy. That was something that was attractive to me because it was a very engaged learning process. because I was so mentally, physically, and I would argue emotionally invested in it, financially, I never got paid. And that was something that toward the end became, a reality of, this isn't, we're not, independently wealthy. This isn't just a hobby. What it did do is it made me double down that I felt a calling, that I wanted to do more. I felt that I hit my ceiling, both figuratively and literally, in the reach of the gallery, meaning building community around creatives, that I wanted to dig in and do more of that. I don't think that really answered your question, but it's constantly being curious and asking and researching and wondering. It's a relentless process that wasn't easy. It was a lot more challenging than I thought, but it was so unbelievably rewarding for me.
With how rewarding it was, it must have been hard to walk away from the gallery.
Yeah.
And I came across an article in Columbus Monthly, and the final question is, will you continue to engage, or do you see yourself continuing to be a voice in the visual arts world? And your answer was, will I continue to engage and support individual artists? Yes. I gained so much perspective from the artists in the art community and hope to never stop. To me, that feels like a very clear through line to where you're at today with Meleca Creative Advisors. But was there any spark of that then? And how do you go from a gallery curator to what you're doing now?
There was no idea at all. I didn't know what I was going to do. I remember leaving feeling sad because I loved being what I called Switzerland. I didn't have to choose sides, whether it was discipline or institution. I loved supporting them all. I knew that I wanted to double down into my advocacy or championing of the arts. I still felt that the arts were misunderstood. They didn't have a seat at the table. I wanted to use my voice to dig deeper. And I felt that outside the gallery, aside from the fact that I really needed to, we've got 2 kids, I needed to contribute financially at home, but I also I felt like I had reached this plateau that, okay, I've figured this out. How can I go deeper? So when I left, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I am fortunate that I had wonderful, close-knit mentors, one in particular that ran the Ohio Arts Council for 30 years. I remember sitting in his den one rainy March afternoon and said, I need to pivot. I want to shift. I want to do more, but what is that? And so to have that support, to have my husband's support, I mean, that was the biggest thing. It's like, okay, just believing in me that I knew what I wanted innately, but I just didn't know what that was. Shortly after that, the position at what was Ohio Citizens for the Arts became available, executive director. And that is a statewide advocacy organization that at the time had been around for 40 years. I hadn't heard of the organization before, which I thought was interesting given my political background. It was advocacy. So they, in essence, lobby for funding for the Ohio Arts Council. That to me was like, oh, okay. All of my 20 some years in politics and reporting and government relations and working on the inside, I know how that works. I know that language. Now I've spent nearly 7 years in a master class to learn about how the arts works. I want to be that mediator, that interpreter, that connector, if you will. That was 3 months before the pandemic. And I knew when I joined that I wanted to expand that service or that advocacy. Didn't know what it was. When the pandemic hit, it took me maybe 3 days to realize, oh, wow, we've got to do something. And so it was really gave the ability to dig deeper and experiment and listen. What do people need, and what are the stakeholders or the policymakers missing? And it was the highest unemployed sector was getting zero attention. Then that, like, digging deep, and it just became a 24/7 obsessive way of figuring out how do we get in front of policymakers to ensure that the arts are heard and seen.
How was Meleca Creative Advisors born out of that experience? Because it's very clear you gained a much more broad understanding of the overall arts world outside of just the physical visual art that you didn't have prior to that position. So going through the pandemic, being an advocate, how did that then birth Meleca Creative Advisors and the projects that you're working on now?
So yes, in the first 6 months of running this statewide advocacy organization, it was apparent that multidisciplines I needed to understand. But then the big thing that was aha was, oh my gosh, wait, there's a difference between a presenting theater and a producing theater. And then there's unions and actors equity. And like they were all, and then are there permanent seats? Can you move this? There was all of this stuff. I kind of see you smiling, so you get it because that's your world. I knew nothing about those dynamics. I loved learning about that. I would get a phone call from an arts executive saying, Angela, we've got to lay off 25 people, but in order to be able to afford paying into the unemployment system, those 25 people, I have to lay off 50. It's like, what are you talking about? And learning that nonprofit arts traditionally don't have to budget a lot in unemployment because there isn't that much turnover. But we had to lay off so many to just survive who knows how long, that they had to go through twice as many. Or in the first 3 weeks, getting calls saying, we don't get unemployment because we're a gig and contract worker. And it's like, well, what do you mean? And then spending every day lobbying the governor's office to say, please write a letter to FEMA to declare Ohio a natural disaster so they can allow for gig and contract workers to get unemployment. All of those things was like fuel to me in a way of seeing really that there was no safety net. There is no safety net for this sector. That propelled me. In 3.5 years, we were able to raise $160 million from state government for nonprofit arts, which was, I was told many times, you're never going to be able to do that. It took me 2 years to get $50 million in ARPA, and I literally kept saying, I'm not going to stop until they say stop, like quit coming here. And I wasn't getting that. So I kept going, and we got it, in 3 a.m, the last night of session of that year. So there are internal goals that I set for myself that I want to maintain. When we were coming out of the pandemic, I was a little surprised because I thought, I'd spent almost 7 years with the gallery hearing organizations talk about donor fatigue and this lack of, audience and all of these hamster wheels and just scarcity, and all of these objectives. So then we get into the pandemic and I think, okay, let's shake up the model. Like, let's figure out how we can make a more sustainable sector. And so I did a lot of conversations with the state and have ideas and how can we get deeper funding or what does that look like? And so I was really hopeful that our messaging, our talking points, our language was really getting across that these are businesses. This is a creative workforce. You're not innovative unless you're creative. I didn't go in talking about quote unquote the arts. I went in and talked about the creatives, the highly skilled tradespeople. We transcend all industries. Every industry is a silo. The only thing that crosses that is creativity. All of these things. But to see that the sector, I know justifiably everyone was exhausted, fatigued. They just wanted, I think, get back to normal, quote unquote. And I was like, we got to lean in to make this change. Let's not fall back into habits, behaviors of pre-pandemic because it was only going to get harder. Audiences never came back the way that they were pre-pandemic. Everyone's streaming now. Corporate has changed all of their philanthropy to go to social good. So it was only going to get more challenging. And it wasn't at the time realizing that this was happening, but I think I plateaued again. And it was like, okay, I want to dig in deeper, which is when I left and I had people say, well, what are you going to do? I'm going to do the work, but deeper. And it's like, what does that mean? And I didn't know what that meant. Once again, I have a husband who's very supportive, and I just and faith, and had to believe that I'm being called to do something that I don't necessarily know what, and financially isn't stable, but I can't just check a box. So when I left, I started consulting because I really wanted to help organizations reframe their impact to resonate on a way that would lead to better resources and revenue. So I started calling this the Renaissance of Relevance, because I knew that if the arts were viewed as relevant, resources and revenue would follow. But we're always having to justify why the arts matter, why we're important, what we do. And so I really focused in on how do we create a new language, because I sat across the lawmakers' desks time and time and time again. Economic impact is not moving the needle. And we have said that story for 30 years. And so I knew that if economic impact only isn't moving the needle, and we know that there is transformational, life-altering changes coming because of the arts and participation, et cetera, what is that, and how do we figure that out?
From an arts admin standpoint, that's always been something that we know, but we can't quantify that in any way.
Right.
And so how do you then shape that into a way that you can present that to someone?
Well, I didn't know right away, but I thought there's got to be a way. And so I have got books everywhere. I've got all these things about, I heard there was a second chord. What was perplexing to me, I've got the book called Your Brain on Art. Time and time again, we have neuroscience and all of these studies about the impacts of the arts and how critical, but yet nothing's moving the needle. And so that was frustrating me. I could get a little ticked about, like, why is this not changing anything? And so in my work consulting with a client a year ago, the question from a donor who focuses on human kindness wanted to know how their sponsorship of an event was going to guarantee to spread kindness. And it sort of became a little joke, a little bit of like, oh, that's great. Like, how do you measure kindness? Like, what do you mean? Like, everybody's just smiling and they're happy when they leave. We've got 5,000 people show up. Doesn't that mean that this is a good thing? And so in talking again to my inner circle, someone said to me, you need to meet this woman who she had been telling me for 5 years to meet. And I said, you've been telling me, just introduce me. And this is a woman who also is in my town, focuses on assessing outcomes for the social nonprofit sector. She's an organizational psychologist. She's an expert in research data for more than 15 years. And then she developed a tech tool that you can input these assessments that the social sector have been doing to get real-time impact data on these social nonprofits. My first question when I got her on the phone is, I said, can you measure kindness? Yes. Can you measure empathy? Yes. Critical thinking, creativity, collaboration? Yes. And I thought, what is this? Like, why haven't we done this? So we had a meeting, and I quickly learned about the standards and that there are provable, validated assessment. There's a whole field out there that they do assessments, and that other industries use. The medical field uses it, education uses it, but it's never been in this way applied for the arts. And so what started out as one client who I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could measure kindness, turned into what is now 20 organizations later, where we raised funding to not only build a logic model specifically for the arts, but have given these 20 organizations a free license to use this tool to case study and have a proof of concept that, yes, we can, in a quantifiable and qualifiable way, measure arts public value. We can measure creativity, job transferable skills. We can measure empathy. And so that's what we've been working on. And that's now what drives me and has been driving me for the past 10 months.
So you're piloting this study with 20 organizations currently.
Yes.
And that will give you an initial data set. And then is this something that you will be offering to organizations as a service for them to measure their impact within their communities across the country following these pilot studies?
Yeah. And so the pilot, I call it a pilot because we've not done this. And so I needed some grace or some wiggle room to figure out how does this work, because we are asking organizations to change mindsets, to become data-driven organizations. I am a firm believer that impact can equal investment. I'm a firm believer that if we want to get significant investment in the arts, if we want to change how people value the arts in a ROI, ROA mindset, we have to have data. And I'm not talking about economic. That data are outputs. That's how many attended, how many tickets were sold, what's your budget size. What we're measuring is not how many per se, but what happens to the many that participate. How are they changed, and what value does that add to communities, not only in the United States? We're working with Toronto Arts Council. I've been invited to go to Europe and speak about this summer. I mean, it's been a really interesting phenomenon to be in, where we're taking a concept again that has been applied and proven with other industries, but we've not done it with the arts. One of the things too that is really important to me is that this is a collective, that these aren't 20 organizations that are kind of doing their thing. They are all using the same assessment tool. We've got, I think, up to 12 different buckets, if you will, that we can measure. Not every organization uses that. We actually advise and say, start with 2 or 3 and measure those really well. And you can expand that if you want. These are organizations of all sizes and all disciplines, because I wanted it to be a tool that could be as universally used as possible, so it's as cost effective as possible. And then the beauty of it is, because being a collective and kind of having this backbone license that these 20 have underneath, they go on. So I'm calling this a CIM. So if you can think of a CRM, when you go on Salesforce or whatever, it's a very similar database desktop. You log in and there's your platform. You've got all of your participants are uploaded in there. You can see how many people you serve, and you can start seeing the outcomes. All of that 20 individually they own, but that all feeds up into this backbone. So we're now getting a collective sector wide that the envision or vision is to expand and add on and have 500 or 5,000. I mean, and then you have this data that can show that 87% of the people that engage in our program have a decline in loneliness, or 93% of the people that come through feel more connected to community, or their critical thinking. We can do all of these different measurements and have individual, organizational specific data that they can use for whatever fundraising, marketing, recruitment, and then we can have a global data. So we're now comparing apples to apples.
All of this really is designed to measure impact, but designed to measure impact towards the means of securing funding by illustrating the true impacts of art that we've all always known have been there, but have never been able to quantify. Is the goal to further develop government funding, or to further develop private investment into the sector? With changes at the NEA currently, and changes within the current arts field from a national level with the current presidential administration, for the first time in a long time, there's discussion about whether government funding is the right avenue to fund the arts, or if we should really be exploring other avenues of funding through philanthropy. Or what is your opinion on how the arts are funded currently, and long term, if that is sustainable, or if that's something that for the arts to be truly independent, we should be looking towards other funding?
Short answer, no, the current funding model is not sustainable. I didn't think it was sustainable in 2022 under a different administration. And I believe that the arts are nonpartisan, in the sense that we've been very fortunate in Ohio, which has been, Republican led for a long time. Those that we the funding, the $160 million came from what was arguably the most conservative Republican caucus in Ohio state history. So again, that's where the importance of how we communicate arts value. Before I go on the funding model, what I've discovered with this data measurement is more than the initial, can you measure kindness or empathy? I think that there are three things that we can do with this data. First is we can measure outcomes. We can measure the benefit. What are we tangibly doing to communities through this? What can you do with that data? You can fundraise. You can use it for your grant responses. You can go to, foundations, philanthropy, individual donors. That's one thing. Secondly, we can monitor our programs. Do we have the outcomes? Are we having the impact that we think we're having? And I would argue that some organizations might be a little nervous about, are we really having the impact and reaching the sector that we want to reach? But I think it's a good thing to be able to have a tool, because then we can use that as a way to strengthen our programs. And then lastly, what I think would be really interesting as well is to take this information and use it like a brand. So start talking like other companies. For example, I use this analogy. I don't know if it's the best. I buy Nike shoes because I want to feel like an Olympic athlete, right? If we can take this data that shows that 87% of the people that came felt more connected to community, or, loneliness is decreasing, that's a way that we can market to audiences we don't reach, because they don't know what to expect with that experience. We can now take that and talk about it in ways on, you can expect to feel this way too, just like audience goers are there. So I think that there's so much that we can do with the data, in addition to funding, which is very important. I think with the current political climate, and I've been saying this now, I've been out speaking at various conferences around the country, that, I would focus on where we think we would have some successes and some wins. And originally, the NEA came about in the 1960s. One of the Rockefeller brothers was instrumental in kind of pushing it, and it was tied towards arts education. And I just read recently, and it was interesting, that there was questions back then on how much money the federal government or public funding should go to the arts because of arts excellence. And we didn't want too much of this carryover into the arts, that the public sector would then determine what is art, what isn't art, or what that looks like. And then as we see foundations, corporations, philanthropy shifting to the social sector predominantly, I think that there's an opportunity for us to show through this data what we've always known, which is the arts do have a social component to it. It is all about emotional, social well-being. It's about job preparedness. There are all these different things that we can talk about that we do, but now we'll actually have the data to back that. So I think that these are opportunities for more cross-collaboration. I think that the arts has put themselves in a box over time. I know firsthand, advocating for funding, talking about $50 million and having lawmakers say to me, where does that even go? What do we even do with it? Like, it's just like we're this oddity. And I said, we're not this special case that you just put in a box up on the shelf and just keep us there. These are business relief grants. Treat us like every other business. Treat us no different from any industry that's coming that needs business relief. That's what helped carry the 50 million over the finish line, is because we wanted to be recognized as a business. So I think if we can expand how our current model works, because again, these are models that were brought about the 60s, 70s, 80s, that we're still operating pretty much under the same funding system. A lot has evolved since then. There was a study in 2000 by the Wallace Foundation that Ohio and about 5 other state arts councils were involved in. And they showed that we've got to get away from transactional measuring of the arts outputs and get into transformational measuring. I think that also shows that because so much of our work does deal with mental well-being, there could be opportunities that we could get funding from corporations or departments or institutions that also have a mission of improving mental wellness. I would just say, as a creative sector, we should get a little more creative in thinking about the possibilities, because I think that they are endless. There's a lot of money out there. And I think that we've pigeonholed ourselves to our detriment now.
Well, I think that you're creating terminology simply with your ROA, return on the arts, using that in alignment with the ROI that the corporations hone in on a regular basis. You are shifting the terminology to begin with to something that corporations and business people understand directly, as opposed to something that we can't quantify.
Yes, I would say that's maybe my sweet spot. I love figuring out language in a way that I'm looking through somebody else's lens. And how can I communicate or convey a message on what this sector or this workforce is going through in a way that these people who say, oh, I know nothing about the arts. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, the arts, my wife goes, and, I've heard it all. And I would argue that the ROA is so much more valuable from a long-term permanence perspective than an ROI, which is a short-term transactional funding component. But we're changing lives, and that will have a lasting impact. And so that's kind of where I want to get in with this data is, sure, you can spend doing this quick flip ROI, but you want to see real everlasting change. That's where the ROA comes in the investment in the arts.
So in addition to the amazing work that you are doing in recreating the way in which we look at how we affect the communities and how we can speak about what we do in the arts sector, you also have this fantastic podcast called Arts Redefined. And I have listened to the entire catalog, and it's something that I tune into every week now. So I wanted to finish this podcast with a question for you that you ask on a regular basis. Now that you have experienced art from the buyer perspective, then to a curator's perspective, and then into a funding advocacy perspective, and now into an analytics perspective, how is it that you now define art?
So I'm not sure if this will quite answer it, but maybe. So I have found, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that I've become more faithful, and that's something that I've not often talked about. And I feel that it's something I should talk about. But I've actually been exploring the Bible more on where art appears. And I will be having actually a priest coming on the podcast soon to talk about this, because I feel that art is from our very nature of beginning. And we talk about the creator. What a gift it is to be born with that ability to create. I never thought that I was creative or an artist. I said I didn't come from an arts background. I since have learned that everyone's creative. They're creative in their own way, whether you're a physician or you're a lawyer or a scientist or an astronaut. And so art transcends everything and is the foundation of our beginning.
I think that is a beautiful sentiment to end on. Thank you, Angela, for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and you being here.
Josh, this has been really uplifting for me and great. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to There's No Business Like. Our producers and hosts are Brian Zelmer, Josh Benson, Kevin Maynard, Katie Miller, and me, Danielle Van Hook. Views expressed in this podcast are ours alone and are not reflective of the organizations we are a part of. Keep up with us at nobusinesslike.com. There you'll find links to all of our episodes and socials. If you like this podcast, give us a like, a follow, a review, or our favorite, a 5-star rating. Oh wait, what was that site? I got it, don't worry. It is nobusinesslike.com. Do I sound out bus-I-ness every time I type it? Yep, sure do. Stay in touch, my friends.